If there are any further signs of development of particularly of nuclear weapons, then I think there will be a return to the fight on the part of Israel. That doesn't necessarily mean there will be a series of airstrikes. We could see further sabotage attacks as we saw before the war occurred, but I don't think we can say it's definitively finished. No, not until perhaps the regime is overthrown in some way, which is a possibility.
I want to ask about the latest with Iran and Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu was just in Washington, D.C., meeting with President Trump, and the president of Iran just did an interview with Tucker Carlson. Can we definitively say that the war between Israel, the US, and Iran is over?
No, I don't think we can. I mean, I think the war, basically the 12-day war, as it's been dubbed, is pretty, achieved a huge amount, both by Israel and the US, and did severe damage to Iran's nuclear program, possibly even completely destroying it, at least for the time being. Doesn't mean to say it can't be rebuilt. And also, of course, to Iran's ballistic missile program. But obviously, Israel in particular, but the US as well, will be monitoring the situation in Iran, seeing exactly what they're doing. And if there are any further signs of development of particularly of nuclear weapons, then I think there will be a return to the fight on the part of Israel. That doesn't necessarily mean there will be a series of airstrikes. We could see further sabotage attacks as we saw before the war occurred, but I don't think we can say it's definitively finished. No, not until perhaps the regime is overthrown in some way, which is a possibility.
Donald Trump was very bullish after the American airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. He basically said, mission accomplished, we've taken them out, job done. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think the job has been done. I don't think there's any doubt that following relentless Israeli strikes against the Iranian nuclear program over the 12-day period, plus the US B-2 attacks, I think it's almost certain that the nuclear program is now at a halt. It may not have been totally destroyed, but it's certainly enough damage done to it to prevent it from being resumed immediately. I think it's impossible really to do away with a country that's intent on creating its own nuclear weapons, particularly if they retain the knowledge and the expertise to rebuild it from where it's at now. But of course, Israel did a lot of damage to that as well by killing a large number of nuclear scientists, some of the most significant nuclear scientists. So I think pretty much the job's been done. And the other factor to bear in mind as well is the psychology of the Ayatollahs. Now, I don't pretend really to fully understand the way they think, and I don't know if anybody does outside of Iran really. But there's no doubt they will have been hugely shocked by what happened to them. They didn't expect it to happen. It had been threatened, but they weren't expecting it. They've been playing the West along with them for a long time now, and finally they got their comeuppance. That will put them into a difficult position, I think. Obviously, some of Khomeini's key advisors have been taken out. Some of his military infrastructure has been taken, or his military command structure has been taken out, and a lot of his military infrastructure. And I would suggest that will probably put them into a position where they won't want to be attacked again and humiliated again as they were over that 12-day period. And so maybe they will just pause whatever their plans are and maybe try and wind down the clock on President Trump and on Prime Minister Netanyahu in the hope that maybe later, in a few years' time, the conditions will be better for them to consider restarting the program.
Is there anything practically that Iran can do against Israel or against the United States militarily? Could they strike Israel or continue to try and attempt to strike Israel with drones and with ballistic missiles and things like that? Or do you expect them to they haven't really responded. They attacked the US military base in Qatar, but it looked like they tipped off the Qataris and therefore the Americans about this. So I suppose my question really is, will Iran continue? Will Iran, do they feel that they've lost face over this whole debacle?
Yeah, I think the attack on Qatar was a sign of weakness because they warned the Qataris and the Americans that they were going to do it, and it resulted therefore in in no serious damage to the United States, certainly no deaths or wounding, which would have been their objective had they been serious about it. They simply had to show, as is kind of the mindset in so much of the Middle East, to show some kind of retaliation, which didn't amount to very much. Also, they haven't activated their proxy networks in Europe or the United States, which exist to carry out terrorist attacks in retaliation or to deter attacks against Iran. Those haven't been activated. If they were activated, they didn't respond. So I think it looks like they are pretty much subdued for the time being. We can't obviously let our guard down totally, but don't forget they've had their primary jihadist proxy, Hezbollah, written down to such a considerable degree that they weren't able to respond even to the attacks against Iran. And bearing in mind the primary purpose of all those missiles, those Hezbollah missiles in Syria, in Lebanon rather, were exactly to do that, were to act as a deterrent or a response if Iran was attacked, and it didn't operate at all. And likewise, other networks have been written. Hamas, of course, have been significantly damaged over the past 20 months of war, almost to the point of being unable to operate at all. There are obviously exceptions to that, and we've seen attacks against Israeli forces even just in the last few days. But it's on the way out. And the Houthis, of course, seem to be the one remaining Iranian proxy that's capable of any action. And the more they do, the more they're going to come under attack. So I think Iran at the moment is in a pretty impotent position.
What do you make of the political arguments against Donald Trump getting involved in wars in the Middle East, as he did with this attack on Iran? People like Tucker Carlson and others have argued, well, look, Trump was elected on a promise to stop getting involved in foreign wars. Why does it matter if Iran has a nuclear weapon? Israel, they have a nuclear weapon and they don't admit it, and they basically did it against the wishes of the United States government in the 1960s. So what do you make of this sort of political view that Trump, he made this promise not to get involved, he shouldn't have got involved?
Well, on the alleged Israel nuclear capability, which of course Israel doesn't admit to, but most people strongly believe is present, that's purely a defensive mechanism for Israel. It exists if it's there at all, it exists to defend Israel from attack around the region. And one thing that sort of underlines that is that no other Arab country, since Israel was believed to have a nuclear capability, no Arab country in the region saw fit to develop its own nuclear capability because they weren't afraid of Israel. They weren't afraid of Israeli nuclear aggression. Iran, of course, is a different proposition altogether. Iran had tried to develop a nuclear weapon system. It's proven its aggressive intent. It's sworn death to America, death to Israel. It's attempted to strangle Israel through proxies in the region. There can be little doubt that Iran would use that nuclear weapon if it actually got to it. At least no sensible person would assume that they're not going to use it. And not only against Israel, but also against their other enemies in the Middle East. Iran, the threat of Iran nuclear attack was just as high to Arab states as it was to Israel. They hate Sunni Arab states just as much as they hate Israel. And of course, ultimately, the weapon could be used against European countries and the United States in due course when missiles were developed with sufficient capability. So it was absolutely right for Donald Trump to do his bit in neutralizing Iran's nuclear program. And it's not kind of, I think a lot of people have compared it to the Iraq war, to the Afghanistan war. It was nothing whatever like that. It was a surgical strike against a specific target and then an end. So it wasn't a kind of never-ending war as we hear about before. And I think, those people who draw the comparison and say Trump shouldn't have done it, they're just really comparing apples with cheese or something like that.
Obviously, North Korea has nuclear weapons, as does Russia, China, India, Pakistan. Again, the argument goes that if these countries, particularly a country like North Korea, which is essentially a rogue state, and Russia and China, which are both strategic opponents, or enemies of the United States, if they can have nuclear weapons and not use them, then Iran having a nuclear weapon is just another, I mean, it's not a good thing, and I'm sure that no one actually supports that from happening, but sending or using American military might in Iran to prevent them from making a weapon, that's another proposition. So what do you make of the argument that, look, it's not, we shouldn't get involved, all these countries already have nuclear weapons, Iran is, you know, we don't want them to have a weapon, but we also shouldn't be involved in what's going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, I mean, that argument doesn't really add up at all, because take Pakistan as an example. Pakistan, it may have many, many faults, but it is a reasonably rational player. Pakistan is not actually threatening anyone with nuclear weapons. The Pakistani nuclear program exists to counter really India's nuclear program, and I don't think either of those two countries are sufficiently irresponsible to use them any more than probably Russia or China would. And North Korea, of course, should have been stopped from getting nuclear weapons. But of course, you know, successive US leaders failed to take the action that was needed there. That doesn't mean that it should be that failure should be extended to countries like Iran. And one other thought, I think, on North Korea is that although it may be a rogue state, it's also, I think, very heavily under the influence of China. And I believe that China is likely to act to restrain any use of nuclear weapons by North Korea. Of course, we can't guarantee that. And it'd be much better if North Korea's nuclear program was dismantled. But we are where we are on that front.
You are a great supporter of Israel and the IDF. That is, again, controversial among some on the American right who say that Israel has far too much influence on the US. I'm sure they would extend that, you know, onto Britain as well. That Bibi Netanyahu has too much influence over Donald Trump, and that the Trump administration is putting the needs of Israel ahead of the needs of America. What do you make of this broader argument that Israel has far too much influence across the West, and that we should be putting our own nation's interests first rather than that of Israel?
Well, of course, every nation should put its own interest before any other nation, obviously. And I think the idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu has undue influence on President Trump, I think if you believe that, then you don't understand President Trump's character. We've seen that Trump will act as he sees fit. Yes, of course, he will take into account what Prime Minister Netanyahu says, but he will then make his own decisions. Equally, he'll take into account what other people say, but he's his own master. So I think that, you know, another point on that is that the US and Israeli interests and Israeli and British interests and US interests actually do coincide. Israel really is at the forefront of a global struggle against international jihadism. And we were reminded, it may not have affected us as badly or the US as badly as it's affected Israel, but that's why they're right on the front line. It affects them the most. But we're reminded of the threat we faced just a few days ago on the 20th anniversary of 7/7, the London Underground and bus bombings. That hasn't gone away. That threat remains. It makes up the vast majority of violent terrorist activities here in the UK. And there have been numerous attacks since 7/7, in the 20 years since then, and even more, far more, that have been prevented and disrupted by the police and MI5. And by the way, a lot of that disruption and prevention has been due to intelligence assistance from Israel. So we share interests, we share threats, we share dangers, and it's absolutely right that our three countries and other Western nations should be acting as far as we possibly can in concert against a global threat that affects us all. And I think it was former President Aznar of Spain who said, if Israel goes down, we all go down. And that's a genuine reality. Israel is seen by our enemies and its enemies as a kind of proxy or outpost of the West in the Middle East, which of course it isn't really, but that's the way it's seen. And that's one reason why it's subject to so much aggression and attack, not just violent attack, but also the kinds of attack and the kind of protests and demonstrations we see on our streets here in the UK and in the US and other countries and on university campuses.
You talked about the 7/7 bombings. There was an anniversary recently. Obviously, this was the attacks in London from Islamic terrorists on the tube network, but also on a bus, killing dozens of people. There has been a reluction, there has been a kind of, some politicians in the UK are concerned about calling these attacks Islamic attacks. And I think there's been some controversy around this of not actually labelling the attacks for what they were. You know, people like Neil Basu, the former head of counterterrorism in the UK, he said that these attacks were about foreign intervention or Western intervention in the Middle East. So what do you make of this idea that these attacks weren't actually Muslim or Islamic inspired attacks? It was actually to do with Western wars in Iraq and so on.
Yeah, I don't think probably apart from outlier organizations like GB News, I don't think you'd have heard the word Islamic or Islamist terrorist attack in connection with the huge amount of discussion that went on the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, because it's politically incorrect to do so. But there's no question these attacks they're not due to actions in the Middle East. They're due to the Islamist extremists or Islamic extremists, however you choose to phrase it, who intend to bring down our society. Things like the Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, other jihadist groups associated with them or not associated with them, but motivating many of them. They're very clear about their intention. It's to re-establish an Islamic caliphate in the West. Of course, there's a convenient excuse of actions in the Middle East for them to attack. And, you know, we heard from Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the ringleader of the 7th of October, 7/7 attacks in 20 years ago, that he is a soldier. He's fighting because of the violence done in the Middle East or in Afghanistan by British troops. But it's not the case. His motivation began over internal Pakistani Islamic disputes, focusing mainly on Kashmir. That's where it began. He then fell in with Al-Qaeda and became involved in the jihad against the UK. So it's a religious war. It's an intent by Islamic extremists to establish a caliphate, to control the West. And it's not just being done by violence, it's being done by numerous other means as well in many of our countries.